I'm going to turn the floor over to Kamau.
Good afternoon. How are we doing? Fantastic. It's truly a privilege and honor to be here, to have this conversation. I'm a major fan of conversations, and the work that we do is all about conversations. Black Gotham Experience, as you can see, it's a visual storytelling project, and we celebrate the impact of the African diaspora on New York City. Just curious, anybody's been to New York anytime recently? All right, that's what's up. Good to see you. If you haven't, it's okay too. So one thing you may notice if you're walking around New York currently, there's a temporary public art exhibition that right now is the largest recognition of the Black experience in the financial district of New York City. It's on Gouverneur Lane, it's on Water Street, and I'm presenting it as something that I've been able to create as a citizen, as an artist, not even as an organization, but working with the Department of Transportation and the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council. We've been able to present these series of timelines and artworks that celebrate the Black impact that's often not looked at in New York City. And like I said, it's something I've done as an individual artist, not even as an organization, just to kind of show that New York is willing to open up and embrace and talk about some stories that often are not discussed. And so this is one of my openers to show that no matter what I talk about that is not being discussed, that right now, anybody who's a gatekeeper, have those kind of conversations, things can begin to move. And we also have this space in the Seaport District in Lower Manhattan, and this is also like a private-public partnership where there's a corporation that manages a lot of the Seaport District real estate that has given us space for a time period to actually have conversations, to have a hub, to meet for our walking tours, work on a graphic novel series, to talk about the impact of Black people on New York that isn't often talked about. And by showing these two slides, I want to use it as a way to define what we do, because we first started off by doing walking tours that began in 2010, and then began realizing through research that often no matter how many books you read about Black people in New York City, or Black people in general of a certain era, you never get any images of them. It's like a major, they'll have portraits of slave masters, there'll be maps, but you don't see the Kofis, the Caesars, the Sarahs, the Hannibals, the different people who might have been involved in uprisings, might have been involved in revolution. You miss their image. And so as a person who loves comics, who grew up and loved, photography and the arts, I was like, wouldn't it be cool to create a photography-based graphic novel that could bring people into the actual creative process as a form of historic healing, but also it would be pretty cool. And so that took the whole project in a different direction where now we can talk about things in a way that's visceral, that makes it far more inclusive, a lot less loaded, but you still can have the serious conversation as well because you're leading in with your eyeballs. One way I often talk about it is you can't deny good food. You don't ask what the ethnicity is per se. It's like, if it's good, it's good. And so I'm thinking about leading in with strong visuals. People can walk down the street, see something, and ready to have a conversation. And so I want to ask a question that I want us to come back to at some point in time, so I want to give you some time to think about it. All right, New York City, one of the world's most famous cities, has a missing century of visual memory. We don't think about it, but it's right there in front of our faces, and it's always been missing. If you consider colonial era, a lot of times it's Virginia, it's Philadelphia, it's Massachusetts, but New York becomes the nation's first capital. New York is one of the first major battles of the Revolution, right there in Brooklyn. But the first 100 years, from 1664 to 1764, right before the Stamp Act is passed, it's almost a complete black hole. So I want to ask you to think, what have you seen in the form of artifacts or popular culture that depicts that first 100 years? And if you're thinking gangs in New York off top, it doesn't work. I get that a lot. The first century, from the moment that Stuyvesant signs the Articles of Capitulation with Richard Nichols, and it's no longer New Amsterdam, it's New York City, all the way into the next century, what have you seen in pop culture visually that shows you what happened in New York? I discovered this black hole by trying to find the Black history and began to find lots of Black history, but often this abyss drowns it out because you can't quite see what happened. So this project I'm involved in is an ongoing thing, it's not over. It's a continuation of digging, trying to find, engaging people in a conversation through walking tours, but also making it visual through the graphic novel project. And so one thing that I do, I call non-destructive editing. When you have a projector and you're given a walking tour at night, you might come across monuments or spaces that suppress and don't talk about the Black experience going back to the 1620s all the way forward. And so I use a projector to cast light literally on spaces that don't talk about this history. And so that way, you're not talking about necessarily tearing anything down or putting anything up. What you're doing is contextualizing the moment for that particular group. And I've been doing this for years before there was a major debate about it. And so sometimes I think people consider it as a possible alternative, but that wasn't what was in my mind. What I'm thinking about is the importance of contextualizing what's in front of you and also what's not in front of you. Because sometimes what's missing is louder than what's actually built. And just like a quick slide to kind of give you a sense of how we're using the visual arts to talk about things we already have seen in different kind of ways. This is one example of how we talk about the Middle Passage, just acknowledging that people who might have been on a ship or in the ocean who have passed away, just showing their souls in a different manifestation. But I want to get back to this monumental silence thing pretty fast because I think that's really the topic at hand. And this is a location right now, I don't know if you guys have been to the museum here in New York for the American Indian, right by Bowling Green. It's a very loaded, historic, layered space. Fort George was there, Fort James was there, Fort Amsterdam was there, but often was not acknowledged that the people who actually completed building the fort came from either the Congo or from Angola, and that's not acknowledged. The same way that leading up from that particular space on Broadway was an actual trail that was expanded by people from the same area of Africa as well, that's not acknowledged. And so when I often go on a walking tour with people, I discuss what's not there, but try to begin to populate that part of the imagination that is the visual abyss that doesn't really have a lot of information. And so it's a collective effort to reimagine it, but at the same time, we're not talking about what's there and how it's painful, but more like how that information often isn't even known. And so it's all part of our experience. This is actual corner where the Wall Street slave market was. I don't know if you, people know about it, sort of, kind of. I know sometimes it's not part of the public consciousness, but how many of us know that the actual Wall Street was built by people from Africa? Anybody know that? Principally built from those from Africa, all right? This was an actual corner at Pearl and Wall Street where the slave market was, and there was an attempt to put a plaque there. It's now like about a block down. I'm not going to get into the backstory of why it's not where it's supposed to be. Might be some different opinions on that, but going back to this whole idea of monumental silence is just not acknowledging that that's the location or acknowledging who built Wall Street. That's louder than anything you possibly could put there that could be offensive. And so I think that it's important for us to keep in mind that a lot of times these conversations that we're having now are really kind of bubbling to the surface, but there's a lot of pain underneath it that's even greater than the one we're talking about. And this is another issue for me. You ever heard of Sam Francis? If you go to Philadelphia, there's reenactments of Sam Francis that show him like my complexion, and most historians describe him as like, you know, like about Drake's color, you know, light skin, of mixed ancestry, and there's all kind of historians who acknowledge the fact that Sam Francis is a person of color who met with George Washington during the Revolution and was a key asset to getting it started. But if you actually walk into the museum or walk into the actual building, they immediately deny he could possibly be a person of color. And so this is also another example of, you know, nothing's really built there that says anything offensive, but the lack of acknowledgement screams the loudest. And so I have one more thing to show you before I begin to wrap up. Federal Hall was destroyed, I think, 1812. But this is one of my favorite places to talk about on the walking tour because there was a very famous trial of the century in 1741 when people that were enslaved and there was a handful of people that were Irish, one person that was English, are going to all have this court case that's going to last for about 6 months. It's the exact same place where George Washington was oath of office. It's the same place where the Bill of Rights was written and also signed. But if you walk inside this actual building, there's no acknowledgement that there actually was a trial of any magnitude that involved 30 people being sentenced to death for trying to overtake the government and make this person named Caesar, that was an enslaved African, the governor of New York, and his friend John Houston, that was Irish, the king of New York. And if you look at the way this entire thing played out through this actual court case, there was all these plots and plans and taverns and conversations about how to actually make a change in New York to actually organize and fight against the British, but somehow that history is just skipped over on a timeline in the actual site. And you could talk about the importance of the site right there in the front with these banners and have this nice image of George Washington as a statue, but I don't find anything that's being said really offensive. What I find problematic is not to acknowledge that entire 6 months of very important history that happened a generation before the revolution that involved people, common folk, organizing, meeting in taverns, and talking about fighting the British to have freedom. But somehow that doesn't fit the mythology or the stories we want to tell, so it's just completely suppressed. And so this is part of what I think is important for us to have, is the conversations. The monuments, very important part of the conversation, but before we even get to the public square, there's certain things we should be talking about before we even get there. And so to end, I just want to show you when I had like less hair. Back when Sarah and I were first met as colleagues at the Tenant Museum, where we talk about a lot of immigrant history, primarily people from Europe. And as a black person having these conversations, I felt like it was a great context to bring to discourse about European history in New York. And in 2008, my life was changed forever when I gave a school group conversation about this tour of German Jewish immigrants and Italian families coming to New York and how they struggled to get success in New York. And after 90 minutes, one of the students who was quiet the entire time finally asked me a question. And it was a very obvious question that somehow just hit me like a punch to the face. She's like, where are the black people? And it felt so obvious that I was like, wow, I spent 90 minutes as a black person talking to a whole school group of black children about German, Jewish, and Italian families, and not once did I mention a black person, not once. And so this little girl is like 12, 13 then, probably like 23 now, 21, like she just, by not being afraid, by not being shy, but by sitting back quietly, waiting for the right moment, asked the right question, and it made me think about it, like I said, not as an organization, but as a citizen, as an artist, as a creative. How can I address her question in a way that can be inclusive and can continue on in the same way that people have conversations at the tenement about history and culture and spaces. And so as I just, phase out of my introduction, I want to just, drop a little exclamation point on that. You don't have to be a large organization to do this work. This is, I think, on a cellular, individual level. If you want to have the conversation, we're all empowered as citizens and as souls to do it. And so that's what I'm doing. I'm having a time of my life, and I encourage others to do the same.